It's very nice to see you all. This is becoming a habit, and I like it. And I approve. In Autobiography of a Yogi, there's a section where Yogananda has traveled to India in 1935-36. It was the only time he went back after he came here in 1920. It was a very long exile from his home. And he took with him his secretary, Richard Wright, who was the brother of Dayamata, who was Fay Wright before she became Sri Dayamata. And Richard kept a journal of his trip, only parts of which are available. I actually saw more of it, and it's not as interesting as you would want it to be, which is one of the reasons why it's not shared all that much. It tends to be more factual than you get the facts, but not the spirit. But in any case, Master quotes from it in Autobiography of a Yogi to describe Yogananda's reunion with his own guru, Sri Yukteswar. And he met Sri Yukteswar when he was in his late teens. After he graduated from high school, he became a disciple of Sri Yukteswar, and Years in My Master's Hermitage in Autobiography of a Yogi are a huge part of that book. Yogananda's mission in coming to America, among other things, was to introduce in the right way what it means to be a disciple. In our discussion yesterday, which Narayan referred to, which was recorded and will be put on the internet eventually, we had a very interesting discussion about discipleship and its role in what Master's teaching us, because one of the things that Americans especially need to learn is not only confidence in ourselves, but a little humility before the wisdom of others. Let's just say that and leave it there. Okay? And so when Yogananda goes back, he was 10 years in his master's hermitage, and then first Sri Yukteswar sent him out to do this work, and he founded a school for children and ran it for a time, but then felt called to America. I mean, Master tells the story so whimsically, as if it was all such a surprise to him. He's meditating, and he sees all these faces going by in vision. Wow, he said. And he doesn't say, wow. My, he says. These must be Americans, as if it was the first time. However, in other places, Master tells us that from the very beginning, Sri Yukteswar said to him, you'll be going to America, your work is in the West. So there's a certain, the word is lila, divine play that goes on when a master incarnates in this world. Swami puts it, it's like going to a movie for the second time. You just let yourself enjoy it, like you don't really know what's going to happen. But of course, if you stand back, you really do know the plot. But I've certainly watched many movies for the second time or third time, and you're just there. It's just happening. It's just as exciting. For me, I always know that nothing really horrid is going to happen, and that's a relaxation for me. So Master's there, and he's seeing Sri Yukteswar, and he has Richard Wright describe it, because for Master it was a deeply emotional return and a deeply emotional meeting, because even though Masters transcend this world, they also participate in this world. So it's rather for us, the percentage of our consciousness or of our reality that is defined by this world is most of it. And then we have this smaller awareness of a bigger context. But for a master, they know the whole context, but that doesn't mean they don't also fully participate in the smallest part of it. The way Swamiji often put it is, to be infinite also means to be infinitesimal. And it's a very important lesson for us on many levels. First of all, simply how to understand, the consciousness of these great souls, but it also tells us that we do not please God by becoming cold-hearted or indifferent to any aspect of His creation. The beauty, the sorrow, every part of it. We participate as the Masters did in all of it. So there, Yogananda, whom Richard Wright has only seen as his own guru, as this God-realized master who stood so far above everyone who ever came into his aura in Richard's experience. Of course, all the Americans were reverencing him, and there were no other men of his stature. But all of a sudden, in the presence of his own guru, Yogananda, in a very real sense, reverts more to what you might call his own nature. Because there's a part of Master's life that we don't hear about a great deal. And Swami Kriyananda tells us about this, which is how often Yogananda himself referenced his own master and referenced Babaji. Once when he was challenged, Yogananda was challenged, why do you call your church the church of all religions when in fact you only talk about Krishna and Christ? And you don't really do as people think when you're ecumenical. You have the Native American shaman there, and then you have the mullah from this one, and you have the rabbi from here, and everybody exchanges comments like this, and in the end, everybody has just proved how tolerant they are when they're with people who are wrong. Yeah. Swamiji makes a great distinction, it's very important, between what he calls the ways of belief and the ways of awakening. He said, on the ways of belief, you will never reconcile it. Because if Jesus Christ is the only Savior, then there really isn't space for Krishna. And if, as the Jews believe, you can't even say the name of God, and to have a picture on the altar, it violates the fundamental principle of thou shalt have no idols. So how can the Jews ever deal with the crucified Christ, who hangs on so many of the altars? Not what to speak of the fact that the Christians hold them responsible for him being there in the first place, which is a lot to forgive. So it's a mess. And we're all well behaved. But in the end, everybody goes away just glad that they have their own way, and that's what it is. But the ways of awakening is really where that longing for unity can be fulfilled. Because once we give our heart completely to Jesus Christ, once we obey the law of Moses in every respect, once we live according to the principles of whatever outward path we're following, what happens to us is the same for everyone, which is compassion, joy, understanding, courage in the face of trials, an appreciation of a reality greater than the obvious, an awareness of life before birth and life after death, which is to say that this is just a tiny window into a greater reality, and that's the ways of awakening. Swami wrote a book on this subject, The Hindu Way of Awakening, but it's only using Hinduism as an example. And this longing for unity that is coming out of the earth, so to speak, at this time as we rise into a higher level, will be satisfied, but not on the level that people are trying to make it work at this time. It has to go much deeper than that, but it will, eventually. Will we live to see it? Will the sectarians blow us all to bits before we get there? Who knows? We'll see. But for Master to come back to him, he played the role that was assigned to him. And his natural role, of course, was to enlighten, to uplift, to teach, to share, to give of his wisdom. He was conscious and had no reluctance to stand in the majesty of the consciousness that he experienced. But in his own self, his humility was based, as he himself defined it, on a simple truth. Humility, Master defined as simply self-honesty, which is, he knew that on this planet at this time, he was an avatar and he was playing the role of the guru. But he knew also, in relationship to infinity, as he called himself, he was just a bulge on the ocean, just a bubble in the sea. So when he found himself in the company of the one who had enlightened him, then he was able, to play that part without the slightest necessity to be anything other than that. I was starting to say, when Master was challenged about the Church of all religions, his answer to that, why do you just do just these two? You can think of how many answers a person could give to that, and how you might become defensive, or not that Master would have, but You want to explain it. Master said simply, it was the will of Babaji that I do this. Because you see, from his point of view, that was a complete explanation. And from his point of view also to show us, discipleship is everything. If this is what my master asks of me, then this is what I do. And Master made it clear in many other places that this is no mindless acceptance. This is from the deepest part of your being to recognize wisdom when it's offered to you and to have the wisdom to accept it. Swami Kriyananda wrote in a most interesting place, a few statements that he was explaining why he was so startled when the first words he spoke to Yogananda were, I want to be your disciple. It's not that he didn't know he was going to say it. It didn't surprise him. But that he found himself in a position to say those words to another human being standing in front of him was a total shock that a week earlier was inconceivable, because a week earlier he didn't know Yogananda. And he met him through the autobiography and then came and knelt before him and said those words. And Swamiji writes, he said there were several reasons why he was so surprised. The first was, quite simply, he never expected to meet anyone for whom he would have that kind of respect. Because if you don't know about God realization or God realized masters, and you're just looking at other human beings who are bright and intelligent, is it just the idea of, you might listen to what they have to say, but the idea of becoming a disciple, which is to say you have committed yourself to attuning to their consciousness because you know they'll take you where you want to go, that is on a level so different than just mere respect. Yesterday I mentioned to people that I had a very, very brief college career. I was admitted into Stanford, which was not quite as hard then as it is now, but still it was a notable achievement, which is why I went, because I was flattered. And I have to add also, I think my parents were too. But it was just a horrible disappointment to me in approximately 7 days. That's about how long I lasted. I lasted a year. I wasted a year of my parents' money, but I actually only took it seriously for about 7 days. 2 things happened. First of all, I went into a class. It was about philosophy of some sort, and I thought we were going to have a discussion of truth. And it was made very clear to me that no, we were going to have a discussion of everybody's possible opinion. And we were going to be extremely careful never to draw any conclusions, but merely to just keep discussing people's opinions. And the thought came into my heart, why? Why would we do this? And then the second thing, which is not a nice thing at all, my married English teacher with 3 children tried to start an affair with me. And I was not. This was the 60s. Things were breaking open. It wasn't that my puritanical nature was so horrified. What horrified me was how stupid he was. And he was supposed to be my teacher. I mean, I didn't have what women have now, where this great sense of disparity of power and all of those things. Excuse me for being a little rude, but I didn't have any of that. I just thought, this man's an idiot. It's like these people know nothing. So I partied for a year and then dropped out. All right. Swami is saying, to whom would I ever disciple myself? He lived in the Western world. He lived a few decades before my college experience, but that was exactly his experience. He talks about college and how he just never went to class and never studied, and sometimes he said he would put a poetry book inside the textbook, even in the classroom, just as a protest, So he was never going to do it. But then he saw Yogananda, he saw his eyes, he read his book, and he realized he was in the presence of something that he had never even imagined existed. And there was one other objection he had. He said he felt the search for truth was so personal, and the integrity of that search was so individual. How could you ever involve someone else in that? Isn't that interesting? But then when he read Autobiography of a Yogi, he had the humility to recognize that here was someone who could teach me. And then when Master himself, as Swami was with him, communicated to Swamiji what it meant to be a disciple, then Swami just embraced. And as he said himself, even if he didn't understand, if Master said it, the first gift he had given, the quality of his giving was that he couldn't reject it. And so even if he had to just stand back until he could understand, he let it come. And you see, it was no different for Master. Because the beauty of this is it's not something that you outgrow ever. You may grow to match your Master. That is, of course, the whole point, isn't it? But still, there's always that extraordinary gratitude that you have. This is the one who brought me. And you're always a child before your own Master, in the same way that we're always children before God. Because humility is simply self-honesty. Who are we? We're just a bubble on the ocean. And Swamiji spoke of Master in that kind of humility. And Richard Wright watched Master just fall at Sri Yukteswar's feet. Just think, I love to imagine it. Think how he felt as a disciple, to see that acted out in front of him. There's another beautiful example from earlier in Master's life, when he was devoted to Master Mahashaya, the blissful devotee in the autobiography. Master Mahashaya was a close disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, who was a great, an avatar who lived in the 1800s in India, near Calcutta. And our Master Yogananda became deeply devoted to Master Mahashaya, so much so that he asked Master Mahashaya, "Are you my guru?" I mean, really, when you think about that denotes something very deep. And there's a whole chapter again in autobiography. And at a certain point, Master talks about that Master Mahashaya walked in front of him, and he was so moved by the presence of God he saw in front of him, he rolled in the dust where Master Mahashaya had walked. I mean, just think of that. There was no affectation. There was no desire to impress anyone. No one was watching. It was just his spontaneous sense of gratitude, of humility, of the desire to receive what this man had taken. It wasn't even touching his feet. It was in the dust where he had stood. Just amazing even to think about, isn't it? Especially when you elevate, as we do, the consciousness of his own. But he is telling us what it is to become a master. You know, everyone thinks it's so important. When Swami Kriyananda was, just one more thing about the dust. There's a film of Swami Shivananda, who was a contemporary of Masters, who lived in Rishikesh, who was revered, deeply revered by his disciples. And a group of wild-looking Indian sadhus come as that in India they can just do that. You can't do that in this country with hair piled up like this and just wrapped in rags and carrying a staff. Just fabulous. Fabulous group of sadhus comes in front of Shivananda, and he walks by them, and just spontaneously they fell and they rolled in the dust of his feet. And it's on film, but it was so moving, because again, there was no affectation. It was just a completely spontaneous response. And to see that kind of uninhibited devotion, it makes one feel that one's efforts are rather paltry and rather concerned with appearances and 1,000 other things. Think of the story in the Bible when Mary Magdalene, when Jesus was having dinner. And in those days, as we understand it, the men and the women were separated. So Jesus is having dinner with a group of men. Mary Magdalene, who is his utterly devoted disciple, but is a woman of ill repute, or had been until Jesus converted her. The legend about her is that she was both glamorous and wealthy and beautiful. And she's become utterly devoted to Jesus, and everyone accepts her because he has accepted her. But the people with a little more sense of propriety, you can imagine, because the human mind hasn't changed much in thousands of years, and people project upon others who they are. And Mary Magdalene bursts into the dinner, kneels at the feet of Jesus, breaks this vial of very costly ointment, which, as the Bible says, the fragrance of it just permeated the room. She washes his feet, then she takes her long hair and uses her hair as a towel. And this is while everyone else is having dinner. She wasn't even invited to the party, right? And she comes in and does this. I mean, who among us would be able to move with her without some sense of, oh my, is this really too much? Which of course is exactly what Judas said, which is why we call him Judas, why his word has become synonymous with the inability to understand what the Master is really asking. But this is what this path is all about. This is who we really need to become. And not in any way necessarily that shows at all, but who we are, in the deepest parts of our heart. And the Masters exemplify this over and over for us. I was, just give me a moment. At the end of Swami's life, we were at the wherever we were last weekend, right? It's at the Ananda village, and they had a little film, just a little picture of Swami, and Dave Bingham, who made that, he called me before he made it, and he asked me to just write up a little something. He'd heard me say something, I guess, or maybe I just made it up. He was asking me about Swami's consciousness, because I knew him for a long time. And my relationship with Swamiji never developed, in the sense that it was, when it began, it was full. I tried to write a book once, and when I was writing a book about him, and there was no progression to it. When I published that book finally of short stories, little stories about Swamiji, there's no chronology, because I don't have a chronology. There was no Swami, and then he was. And he was a different man in those days. By the time we knew him at the end of his life, or many of you knew him, he was so frail. I remember one of the programs he gave her at the Ford Theater, when he was so close to not being able to come. And when he finally appeared on the stage, he had to be wheeled out in a wheelchair, which was not anything he wanted to do. And Swami has a good sense of humor, so I was able to enjoy this. He's introduced as one of the last living disciples of Paramahansa Yogananda, one of the few who's still doing public work. And then this frail person gets pushed out in a wheelchair. And I thought, this is Hollywood. We wrote to the agent, we need a last living disciple. And they interviewed several, and then here was the epitome of the last living disciple, one of the last living disciples. And he's wheeled out, and that particular day he was only able to bring himself back to a certain extent. Most of the time in those last years, it was fascinating to watch, and Narayani and Shurjo can tell you much more, because they were with him every day, literally till he breathed his last. But his debility was entirely physical, and it was really profound physically. I mean, he couldn't walk by the end. He leaned on Narayani until Shurjo came into the picture, and then he leaned on both of them. And every so often, if you happen to slip into that role, which once he had both of them there, very few others ever did, but it was not cosmetic. You were holding half or more of his weight for him to be able to move. And he just the way we take it so for granted, I'll go to here, and then I'll go to here, and then I'll go to here. But his body simply wouldn't respond. So taking that body anywhere was a big project, and it was taken from continent to continent every 3 or 4 months, and it was a big story. Finally, he accepted a wheelchair from time to time, but he always resisted it. And but once the physical body got where it needed to go and was just put down somewhere, it was like the consciousness was never inhibited at all by that. And so marvelously, the older he got, the more, and his face showed it. He aged in a normal manner. But his face got more and more like that picture of himself as a child. And it was that he didn't have any work to do so much anymore. And what I was starting to say is when I first knew him, he was at the beginning of this enormous effort. Ananda, the property that has become Ananda Village, had just been purchased, really, a couple of years earlier, and it was just an extremely motley collection of, of all sorts of very interesting people. We had a woman from Venus, or from the Pleiades, perhaps. Perhaps she was from the Pleiades. A very nice woman, but she just happened to be from the Pleiades, that's all. She just wasn't an earthling. Her husband was an earthling, but she wasn't. We had another charming woman named Mushroom, who always referred to herself as this unit of consciousness. I mean, those were just two random examples, out of which Swami was trying to mold an ashram of disciples of Master. So he was... He had a lot of vision, let's just put it that way, an enormous amount of patience, and he had been commissioned by Master, and he'd been expelled from SRF, and it was all just about to happen. And we could have great faith that he was going to do it, but he was going to have to do it. And even though you may know that the Master is with you, there's no guarantee unless you really, because you can fall, everybody can fall. It's presumptuous to think you can't. So there was always this force that to a certain extent had to, how would I say it, had to maintain the facade of being a powerful, determined, forceful individual, because he had to draw out of the atmosphere, out of the ether, that power to make it work. He had to be the magnet. For those of you who were at the purification ceremony earlier this morning, I was saying there has to be the point at which you invite that power, because it has, unfortunately, total respect for our free will. Sometimes when people come talking to me about discipleship, I don't want someone else to take over my life. I don't want somebody to tell me what to do. No such luck, honey. It's going to be your life right to the end. You can invite that help, but no, it will not be imposed upon you. But once he had crested that hill, and it was clear that the commission that had been assigned to him as a young disciple had been fulfilled, then it was almost like he could revert. And he just reverted back. And in the last years of his life, no matter what subject he was supposed to talk about, he would look at us as if we'd never heard the story and tell us all over again about finding Autobiography of a Yogi and going across the country and meeting Master. And he must have known, or maybe he didn't know, that we'd heard the story before. But it was the only thing that interested him. And to a certain extent, perhaps it was the one thing he cared to remember out of the whole adventure. And once that old body was put into place, that face would just have that child smile on it, and he would just radiate like that. But on one hand, it's like, wow, what an extraordinary man. But on the other hand, that which I do, you shall do, in greater things. This is what Jesus said. Everything about the lives of these masters, these great souls, it's a teaching. They're showing us what the footsteps look like. I was in Hawaii with Swamiji. This would have been in the late 70s. Another woman and I were there. He was editing the first edition of The Path. It's now called The New Path, but the first edition. He'd written it. Somebody gave him a condominium, and he wanted just to be in complete separation, seclusion, in order to work on it. And then the two of us came over to cook and to type and to just sort of help. We were really little people in the story, but I could type, and he didn't. That was before computers. And then one day we were just fried. There was a tsunami warning in Hawaii at that time, and this was before computers, so what we had was paper copies of this book. And we were also always so afraid that the tsunami would come when we weren't in the apartment. So wherever we went, we carried a copy of that book with us, and it was just always under our arms like this. But we decided to take a boat ride one day. I called up to get tickets. How many children, how many adults? I said, 1 adult, and I was about to say 2 children. And I realized that we were in our 30s, and when we showed up, they would not give us a half-price ticket. But I felt like I was lying, you know? It was 1 adult and 2 children. Those 2 children will pay full price. It's okay. But there's that, what it is to be that is completely different. But these words of Jesus, suffer little children to come unto me, it's because of not the way we behave, but the way we regard ourselves. Just the way we see ourselves in true relationship. And it's such a joke. I watched it with Swami all the time. Everybody always wanted to make him be important, you know? And he would say, well, God is the doer. I'm just a channel for Master. Yes, but somebody had to be the channel. They would say like that, you know? As if somehow this was helpful. You know, and eventually he would find a gracious way to end the conversation. But, you know, we're projecting on others what we want. You know, little children don't have to be important in that way. They just want to be loved and to be happy. And then they have to do their duty. We can't get out of it. But the more we understand that, we are just passing this way like little children. Just joyfully and happily. And what is the proper way to worship? It's asked in our reading today. I am in slight relationship to it. With your whole heart. Without regard. To recognize wisdom when it's offered to you, beauty when it's in front of you, and joy when it's given to you. And to be fearless and childlike in our fearlessness, in the way we accept that. God bless you.